theories of global stratification. Stratification and inequality. Stratification refers to the range of social classes that result from variation in socio-economic status. Significantly, because SES measures a range of variables, it does not merely measure economic inequality. For example, despite earning equal salaries, two persons may have differences in power, property, and prestige. These three indicators can indicate someone's social position. However, they are not always consistent. Classifying global stratification. Wealthy nations. The wealthy nations are the most industrialized nations, and they consist primarily of the nations of North America and Western Europe, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, and certain other nations in the Middle East and Asia. Many of them were the first nations to become industrialized starting in the 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution began. And their early industrialization certainly contributed to the great wealth they enjoy today. Yet it is also true that many Western European nations were also wealthy before the Industrial Revolution, thanks in the part to the fact that they had been colonial powers and acquired wealth from the resources of the lands that they colonized. Middle-income nations. Middle-income nations are generally less industrialized than wealthy nations, but more industrialized than poor nations. They consist primarily of nations in Central and South America, Eastern Europe, and parts of Africa and Asia, and constitute about one-third of the world's population. Poor nations. Poor nations are certainly the least industrialized and most agricultural of all the world's countries. This category consists primarily of nations in Africa and parts of Asia, and constitute roughly half of the world's population.
Thank you for that, Ms. Collis. And for the continuation of our reporting about theories of global stratification, I'm going to discuss the two main theories explaining global stratification. So, first is modernization theory. So, what is modernization theory? It's the individual explanation is called modernization theory by McClellan 1967 and Rostow 1990. According to this theory, rich nations became wealthy because early on they were able to develop the correct beliefs, values, and practices. In short, the correct culture for trade, industrialization, and rapid economic growth do occur. And also according to modernization theory, nations in other parts of the world never became wealthy and remain poor today because they never developed the appropriate values and practices. Instead, they continue to follow traditional beliefs and practices that estimate industrial development as modernization. So, modernization has much in common with the culture of poverty theory discussed in social stratification. And also, it attributes the poverty of poor nations to their failure to develop the proper beliefs, values, and practices necessary for economic success, both at the beginning of industrialization during the 19th century and in the 2 centuries that have since transpired. Dependency theory. Dependency theory, it is the structural explanation for global stratification called dependency theory. Not surprisingly, these theories views sharply challenge modernization theory's assumption by Pakenham 1992, whereas modernization theory attributes global stratification to the wrong culture, values, and practices in poor nations. So, Dependency theory blames global stratification on the exploitation of these nations by wealthy nations. And according to this view, poor nations never got the chance to pursue economic growth because early on they were conquered and colonized by European ones. So, dependency theory also has direct implication for strategies to reduce global poverty. Very simply because the theory implies that wealthy nations and multinational corporations must stop exploiting the resources of poor nations. Until that happens, poor nations will be unable to develop their natural resources and to enter industrial age. So, um, according to this view, poor nations never got the chance to pursue economic growth because early on they were conquered and colonized by European ones. The European nations stole the poor nations' resources and either enslaved their populations or used them as cheap labor. And as a result, the colonized nation were unable to develop a professional and business classes that would have enabled them to enter the industrial age and to otherwise develop their economies. So, along the way, wealthy nations sold their own goods to colonized nations and forced them to run up enormous debt that continues to amount today. Because dependency theory implies that poor nations remain poor because of lack of opportunity owing to exploitation by wealthy nations. It falls into the conflict perspective on stratification and addition for dependency theory. And also dependency theory blames colonialism and neocolonialism or continuing economic dependence on a former colonial countries for global poverty. Countries have developed at an uneven rate because wealthy countries have exploited poor countries in the past and today through foreign debt and transnational corporation or TNCs. So, according to dependency theory, wealthy countries would not be as rich as they are today if they did not have these materials, and the key to reversing inequality is to relieve former colonized of their debts so that they can benefit from their own industry and resources. So, someone asked about which makes more sense which more makes sense daw, modernization theory ba or dependency theory? So, as with many theories, both make sense naman to some degree but both have their fault. So, modernization theory places too much blame on poor nations for their own poverty and ignores the long history of exploitation of poor nations by rich nations and multinational corporations alike. For its part naman po, dependency theory naman is cannot explain why some of the first countries are poor even though they were never colonized by European. Neither can explain it why some former colonized such as Hong Kong, have been able to attain enough economic growth to leave the rank of the poorest nation. So, together, both theories help us understand the reasons for global stratification. But most sociologists would probably favor on dependency theory because of its emphasis on structural factors in world's historic and current economy. Thank you.